Hey there, today I wanted to talk about whiteness and 18th century drama. Specifically, I want to focus on the play A Bold Stroke for a Wife by Susanna Centlivre. I'm very interested in looking at the historical context in which these plays take place. I'm very interested in looking at how political spheres, geopolitical spheres influence what is put on the stage. In critical race or critical whiteness studies, scholars have analyzed the ways in which whiteness has removed itself from racial categories or racial categorization through something called white neutrality. Through racial neutrality, it locates itself as central and also dominant within a racial hierarchy. This is because it is either always assumed or expected due to its neutrality. Whiteness is able to maintain power through many different functions. One such way is white neutrality. This can be seen through some peoples, typically through right-wingers or white moderates, in how they are incredibly resistant to certain critiques of whiteness. However, the formation of whiteness can be traced throughout history. As we see, racial formations are always in flux and abstracting. One such period we see an attempt to solidify the idea or identity of whiteness, a white British identity, is in the Restoration period. I will analyze this formation through looking at Centlivre's play, A Bold Stroke for a Wife. I'm specifically going to look at the representation of material objects and how they come to represent and illustrate a white British identity that is rooted in nationalism, imperialism, and conquest. Before getting into the play, I should lay the scene with some historical context. In 1688, there was a dramatic change in British society where the British Parliament invited William of Orange, who was Dutch and Protestant, to overthrow the existing Catholic monarch, James II. While Britain was actively building itself as an imperial power in a global context prior to 1688 under Charles II, the successful revolution that empowered William of Orange created an incredible shift in social and political thought, one that continued to realize itself as an imperial nation. These early imperial desires can also be seen in Restoration comedy as early as William Wycherley's play The Country Wife, which was first staged in 1675. This play features the infamous China scene, where Lady Fidget holds a piece of china which both represents a sexual innuendo and an eroticization of the global as sophistication through possession and appreciation of selected treasures. This sentiment becomes exaggerated as time goes on and post-1688. With this brief historical context in mind, I want to move into A Bold Stroke for a Wife and examine how these desires manifest through the comedic characters and how they construct an image of white British racial identity. I will be focusing my attention on the character Periwinkle, who is described as a silly virtuoso, and Fainwell, who is a colonel. Their interaction represents an ongoing construction of white racial identity. In Act 3, Fainwell attempts to deceive Periwinkle by trading a girdle he claims has magical properties in exchange for Periwinkle's consent to marry Anne Lovely. The girdle is an image of whiteness and how it functions by both centering and making whiteness visible. Fainwell is unsuccessful in swaying Periwinkle with objects such as, quote, an Egyptian idol, 2 tusks of a hippopotamus, 2 pairs of Chinese nutcrackers, and 1 Egyptian mummy. It is not until he reveals a girdle that he claims can turn one invisible, and, quote, by turning this little screw, can be in the court of the great Mongol, the Grand Signor, and King George, end quote. According to Rosenthal, from the, quote, theater and court emerged a new ethos that defined person, sophistication, and refinement in terms of consumption and appreciation of global objects, ideas, and opportunities, built on the profits from unspeakable violence and lingering injustices, end quote. During this period of time, Britain was already engaged in multiple imperial and colonial projects as it had established multiple colonies, trading companies, and was participating in the transatlantic slave trade. The objects Fainwell lists are either from British colonies or would have been traded. In any case, they can all be considered and would be thought of as, quote, foreign. Foreign in this context can be thought as not British, and in turn, not white. The objects are presented as treasures to be consumed and coveted as a means of demonstrating British conquest and power in a global context. The collected treasures Fainwell boasts about work to set boundaries between the self and others. British, and therefore whiteness, becomes defined by what it is not, or what it is commonly referred to as, quote, the other. The revealing of the girdle shifts the focus away from the foreign and centers whiteness as the ultimate object of desire and as a tool of maintaining supremacy. Like the previous items, the girdle is presented as a foreign object of desire. However, the girdle differs in that the proposed purpose is to empower the wearer, in this case, to empower whiteness. The dynamic between whiteness and the foreign objects is clearly demonstrated through the girdle. The girdle, the foreign object, is consumed through a white gaze that desires it as a tool of conquest. Periwinkle finds the girdle appealing in how he might, quote, travel with great expedition, end quote, as he is told it also allows him to travel in such ways that resemble teleportation. The promise of conquest and expansion proposed excludes any financial concerns and can happen instantly, which eliminates the current barriers to British colonialism and imperialism. The girdle also empowers whiteness through its proposed ability to make the wearer invisible. Critical race and whiteness scholars have articulated how whiteness can be imagined as invisible because of how it claims neutrality. It positions itself as neutral, which is effectively erases it from discussions or conceptions of race because it is, quote, neutral. The girdle is a representation of a tool for white's power through its ability to improve colonial expansion through instant travel and a white supremacy through invisibility. While this is all well and good, an important fact remains. The girdle isn't magical. It doesn't perform what it promises. So, how does this fit in with the analysis? Well, from a contemporary approach, the girdle's inability to perform actually aligns with the construction of whiteness. While I am discussing race in this paper, I wanted to emphasize the fact that race is not innate. It's a construct. It's something built, constructed, and performed. Like how the play is engaged with articulating expressions of political freedom, liberty, and performance, the girdle scene demonstrates a relationship between performance and race. Like whiteness, the girdle is not real. It does not actually have any magical powers. It is through performance in where it gains its powers. The power the girdle and whiteness accumulate is through performance and the belief in said performance. When Periwinkle puts on the girdle, Fainwell and Sackbut turn around. When they turn back around, they pretend like they cannot see him, like he's invisible. Periwinkle then gets Fainwell to put it on to demonstrate the authenticity of it, to prove that it's real. When this happens, when they turn around, Fainwell slips through a trap door, and when they turn around, he is gone. At this point, Periwinkle is convinced by their performance and believes that the girdle is magical. He's willing to trade his consent for the prize. The girdle is not real, yet Fainwell and Sackbut's performance and deception have made it real for Periwinkle. While the play is very interested in performance, marriage contracts, and emerging social and political identities, I think the play also acknowledges the projects of British imperialism and colonialism. I think it's quite easy to sometimes read period literature in a vacuum, or as a singularity as if it doesn't exist within the context of when it was created. However, I think it's incredibly important to read period literature, especially British period literature, through a critical lens that does account for these historical contexts, looking at what's present, what is missing, and what is hidden as ways of revealing erased histories. These are some such ways in which we may not reproduce a white neutrality. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed and hope to see you again sometime in the future.